Hello guys, this is your friend. We are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Godlike Naruto build a deadly harem with Hinata, Kurenai, Hana, Anko, Yugao, Kyūbi, and Tenten. Prt1. And if you enjoy this fanfic, then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start a new fanfic. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, looked out over his village through the massive window in his office. Someday I really need to figure out a way to arrange the office that doesn't place this sight at my back. He thought as he admired the view. From up here he could see all the way to the walls, looking down on all the houses, shops and training fields. Even late in the afternoon the streets were still fairly crowded, people moving through the streets like leaves floating on a river. The setting sun dyed everything from the flat-roofed buildings to Hokage monument depicting Hokage that came before, and after, and the foliage of the massive trees. The village was known for a warm orange not unlike that of a fire's glow. It was almost as if it was a representation of the very will of fire itself. Yes, Konoha truly was beautiful. At least it was when one side of the Hokage monument wasn't coated in paint in all sorts of colors. Both the first and second Hokage had been drenched in an interesting mix of orange, purple and green, with large orange swirls drawn on their foreheads. His own monument had barely escaped harm, and the fourth, being the furthest away, didn't even have a drop on him. If that wasn't enough of a clue as to who had vandalized the village's most valued monument, the fact that orange was the most prevalent color left little doubt. You certainly know how to keep busy, Naruto. Hiruzen muttered with a weary smile. As if in on cue someone sunshined into the office in a swirl of leaves. Immediately the Anbu hidden in the shadows tensed, but they relaxed just as quickly when they felt the tattoo on their right shoulder pulse to announce the arrival of one of their own. Once the leaves settled, an Anbu with a hair mask appeared, carrying a squirming blonde boy. Thank you, Nusagi. Only 2 hours this time, the Hokage asked, not turning away from the window. I'm getting better at catching him, m'lord. The Anbu said, lowering Naruto to the floor. But he's still a pain to chase. Hiruzen nodded in understanding. Nusagi certainly still sounded a bit winded. You know, Naruto, if this wasn't so childish it would almost be impressive. Naruto chuckled sheepishly, scratching a fleck of dried orange paint on his cheek. The shirt he wore had once been black with a red flame symbol, but now it was splattered with dozens of little drops of paint and one massive orange stain on his left side. Hey, come on Oji-san. That's a lot of paint to lug all the way up there. That's impressive right there. Hiruzen chuckled softly and finally turned from the window. That much is true, I suppose. He nodded to Nusagi, and the hair-masked Anbu bowed and vanished in another shunshin. Hiruzen sank down into the chair behind his desk and settled in comfortably before he turned his attention back to the 6-year-old standing in the middle of his office, trying his best to look innocent. In moments like this, it was all too easy to forget that the boy contained a creature that could easily destroy this village and everything around it in a 50 miles radius, and had in fact tried to do so. So, what is it this time, Naruto? He asked, resting his elbows on his desk and lacing his fingers together. As much as it seemed the boy acted out just for attention, there was a method and reason behind his pranks. He would go for weeks, sometimes months, at a time without doing anything at all, and then something happened to set him off and Hiruzen had to send people to chase him down again. More often than not his actions were some form of retribution. In fact, Naruto went out of his way not to involve innocent bystanders in his pranks, but that was hard to tell if you didn't pay close attention. The boy had a long memory, and most people had long since forgotten that they had treated him poorly when he finally struck. The worst part about the situation was that Hiruzen couldn't really blame him. He was all too aware how many of the villagers treated Naruto, but all he could do was prevent the worst. He could not always be there. His shinobi could not always be there, and, even if they could, he wasn't always certain he could just trust any shinobi around the boy. Besides, if yet another mob formed to hunt the boy, any decent shinobi would respond with force. That would no doubt result in quite the situation with the civilian council. This was different, though. A stunt on this scale without any immediately clear target meant that Naruto was certainly upset, but not with anyone in the village. It's nothing much, Ojiazan. Naruto said, plastering on a fake smile. The Hokage didn't respond for a moment, aside from slowly raising an eyebrow and shifting his weight. Even at 6 years old, Naruto understood that this was the old man's own way of calling him on his bullshit. A shame, because he'd worked hard on that smile too. Clearly it wasn't happy enough yet. Said smile faltered for a moment and the whisker-marked blonde shrugged. Got a test back today and, well, you know how I am with those. So I figured I'd get my mind off of it by redecorating the monument a bit. He scuffed his feet dejectedly and very pointedly turned his attention to the floor, as if he had found the meaning of life there. And there we have it. Hiruzen thought as he watched the blonde. He certainly was aware of how the boy was with tests. He'd only recently started at the Shinobi Academy, but it was quickly apparent that the boy was certainly no model student. He would have blamed it on genetics, as Naruto certainly shared his mother Kushina's boundless energy and subsequent lack of an attention span. However, while Kushina had not been easy to teach, she had admitted as much herself, she was still an intelligent woman. Plus, there was his father. Minato Namikaze was still arguably the greatest shinobi Konoha had ever seen and, while his academy career had not been particularly noteworthy, his intelligence and skill were very clear even at a young age. Hell, the man had developed techniques and skills even his sensei Jiraiya couldn't begin to figure out. When Naruto started at the academy, Hiruzen had asked to be kept up to date on his progress, and while he had figured sitting in class for hours would be hard for the hyperactive blonde, he hadn't expected him to do quite so poorly. Copies of his tests were passed on to Hiruzen moments after they were graded, and it was clear that either Naruto just didn't read the questions closely enough, or some basic elements of shinobi life continued to elude him. The Hokage shuddered to think what his grades would be like when chakra exercises started. This seems like a lot of effort just for that, Naruto. You're still allowed to resit the test once, right? Perhaps you should have spent this time studying to do better instead. He chided, but Naruto just seemed confused. What are you talking about, Ojiazan? The blonde asked. It's only certain tests that can be retaken, right? That's what the teachers tell me each time I ask. Hiruzen blinked in confusion and slowly a deep frown appeared on his face. Did they now? I certainly haven't approved that change to the system. This was very strange, to put it mildly. It could just be a matter of a confused teacher or someone who had recently started and didn't know, but, Naruto, did you ask multiple times? And multiple teachers? He asked, voice stern. Naruto thought for a moment and then nodded slowly. Not each time, and not all of them. I don't think I've ever asked Iruka-sensei, since I pass his tests most of the time, but I've asked most of the other sensei at least twice. Why? Did I do something wrong? When he heard Naruto's hesitant tone, Hiruzen sighed and leaned back in his seat. He didn't want the boy to think he was mad. At least, not at him. No, Naruto, don't worry. You just reminded me that I need to check on something regarding the academy. Thankfully the blonde seemed to buy the excuse and Hiruzen quickly searched for a different topic. Well, regardless, I hope you understand you will still be punished for this little stunt. The blonde pouted defiantly and crossed his arms, drawing a chuckle from the old man as he gestured for Naruto to take a seat. But first, how about you tell me how you did it? That seemed to lighten Naruto's spirits a little. For the next 15 minutes he went into great detail on his latest prank. There was almost always some form of construction going on in various places around Konoha, and Naruto had used it to his advantage, swiping cans of paint from the various sites and lugging them over to the monument. After that I just needed to look like this was what I was supposed to be doing, though I still avoided the main streets. Pretty good, The blonde student grinned at the aging Hokage. There was this really cool jumpsuit I wanted to buy, so people would think I was a painter anyway, but the man at the counter gave me a really high price and I couldn't afford it. That really ed because it was cool and orange and now I'm gonna have to save up for it. Anyway, come on, Ojiazan. You know you're impressed. Hiruzen was, a little, but Naruto would never stop gloating if he admitted that. Still, to know the location of all the building sites in the village and plan an effective route to and from them to the monument, through the village's winding back alleys and lugging heavy buckets of paint. Well, it was hardly Anbu worthy, but for an academy student it was a lot of work. Sure, the boy had always been a little ball of energy, so the fact that he wasn't tired after carrying all that paint wasn't strange, but it certainly seemed like Naruto had done more planning than the Hokage had given him credit for. It's not the worst plan I've heard, considering you can't use jutsu or travel over the roofs to make things easier. He conceded after a few minutes. Naruto's grin was nearly blinding and Hiruzen quickly matched it with his own. You do, of course, realize that I should make you pay the construction workers for the paint you took. The boy's grin was replaced by a look of horror and the old man chuckled. Relax, Naruto. I imagine if I did that, you wouldn't eat for a week. No, we'll find some other way to punish you for that. The Hokage gave the young blonde a serious and appraising look. However, I will be lenient if you promise me that you will not let this side of yourself slip. Naruto's face twisted in confusion again and he scratched the back of his head. Ojiazan, are you alright? It sounds like you want me to keep pranking people. Hiruzen quickly held up a hand. No. Well, sort of. Naruto, the way you approach pranking is a good way to approach missions if you graduate. You thought about this. You planned this. Did you have an escape plan if you were stopped with the paint? Naruto nodded slowly. Throw paint in their face and run. He muttered, miming the motion of throwing paint from a bucket. Hiruzen gave him an encouraging smile and reached in his drawer for his pipe. See, unrefined, but at least you had one. Planning and thinking about your actions are important. You don't need to be the strongest shinobi, Naruto. Sometimes it pays to be the smartest. The blonde Jinchuriki still seemed rather confused, but the old man could see the gears spinning in his mind as he turned his attention to the window and the monument behind it. But, all the Hokage were really strong. Like you, Ojiazan. If I want to be Hokage, I need to be even stronger than you. Hiruzen chuckled and nodded as he stuffed his pipe. Well, you're not wrong. A cage has to protect everyone in the village, so they have to be strong. I like to think I'm a fairly dangerous opponent, but I've encountered people who hit harder or had more chakra than me. Yet, I'm alive and they are not. Do you want to know the secret as to how I beat them? Naruto's attention snapped back to him and he nodded eagerly. I had a plan, Hiruzen said simply. Naruto's reaction, that simple statement, did not disappoint. For a few seconds his face remained frozen in barely restrained anticipation, clearly still awaiting some grand tale. Then a frown of confusion. Surely there was still another part of this answer. Finally he settled on an unimpressed glare and crossed his arms over his chest. That's it. Hiruzen lit his pipe and nodded with a bright grin. That is it. He had to try his hardest to resist laughing as the young blonde kept glaring at him while he puffed on his pipe. Had I tried to match them in ninjutsu or taijutsu, I would not be here today. He said after a few minutes, figuring that he'd tortured Naruto for long enough. So I planned. I used my mind and found their weaknesses, lured them into traps, used strategies. In fact, with one of them it went so well I managed to bring down a rockslide on him, using the remains of a powerful earth jutsu he himself had used earlier. That put the exited smile back on the Jinchuruki's face and it only grew wider when Hiruzen continued. And you know what? I think you have great potential for this as well. A shinobi's greatest weapon is often his mind and, judging by the pranks my boy, yours can be a really scary place sometimes. Naruto was all but bouncing in his seat now. Really, Ojiazan, can you teach me? You gotta teach me. Who better to learn from than the god of shinobi, after all? Naruto just hoped it didn't involve lectures, like in the academy. The old man rolled his eyes and gently tapped Naruto on the forehead. I can't, Naruto. This is something you need to do yourself. Keep your mind sharp. Think. Maybe visit the library for a bit every day or so. Clearly, the hyperactive blonde wasn't too thrilled about the idea of spending time in the library, but when Hiruzen assured him that he'd developed many of his own techniques by basing them on things he'd read about, he opened up to the idea. Alright then, but don't expect me to start liking reading. Books are boring. You want boring? Try paperwork. The Hokage grumbled, looking at the towering stack of forms on the corner of his desk. He'd gladly go back to the days of taking in squads of Iwagakure Anbu so long as he didn't have to sign a form for it afterwards. With a sigh he looked from the papers to the clock above the door. Well Naruto, I've still got a lot to do today so I think it's time for you to run along. He pulled a paper off of the top of the stack and waved the blonde to the door. Don't think I won't find time to imagine a suitable punishment, though. Naruto sighed but obediently hopped off the chair and headed for the door. Yeah, I know. He paused just before the door, shifting hesitantly in place for a moment before he turned and looked at the Hokage over his shoulder. Hey, Ojiazan, I'm sorry to give you more work. I know you're really busy and I don't mean to make it worse. Hiruzen looked up from the paper he was signing with a small smile. Naruto, even under these circumstances, meeting with you is something I enjoy. It is not work. Now when you graduate and report to me on your missions, then it will be work, but enjoyable work. Get home safe, and send my secretary in, could you? The little blonde nodded happily and stepped out. Hiruzen waited for about half a minute, before he leaned back in his seat and sighed deeply. Hokage-sama, a young woman with long, brown hair that tumbled down her back in a thick wave of curls poked her head into the office. Naruto-kun said you needed me. I take it I should arrange for cleaners to visit the monument. Hiruzen nodded and took a deep puff on his pipe. Yes, Yumi, to both of those. As always, tell them to leave at least a bit for Naruto to clean up himself. However, first please send someone to the academy. Tell them to find Yumi no Iruka. Yumi nodded and pulled out a pen. Hokage-sama, if you intend to meet with Yumi no San, you should remember Mitarashi's team will be in sometime late this evening to debrief. Hiruzen nodded, glancing at much smaller pile next to the paperwork. Yes, I haven't forgotten, Yumi. Thank you. I should have their mission file here. He tapped the file in question and once more bent over his paperwork. At any rate, Iruka is to report in and bring Naruto's official school records, without telling any of the other instructors. The brunette quickly scribbled a few things down on a notepad. The official ones. Are you sure? Official records included nearly everything a student had ever done in the academy. Every test, every assignment. In fact, the only way to get to the original test made by a student as opposed to a specially marked copy, you needed access to their records. To prevent tampering, they were rarely taken out of the records room even by the instructors. Any records that were taken out actually needed to be signed out to keep track of them. Quite certain, Hiruzen answered, and it is a matter of some urgency. Yumi nodded and stepped out again without another word, her sensible gray skirt fluttering behind her as she went. About an hour later, Iruka arrived with the records. Another hour later he was still sat in front of the Hokage's desk, while the old man browsed through the tests, essays and assignments with extraordinary care. Hiruzen liked the dark-haired instructor. The man made a fair shinobi with a good grasp on the lifestyle and a caring personality, but he possessed enough self-awareness to realize he was not cut out for field work. The Hokage was growing less and less pleased, though, with what he had found so far in the records Iruka had brought with him. How is Naruto in class, Iruka-kun? He asked, pulling another test out of the file. The Chunin seemed almost surprised at finally being addressed again, but straightened in his seat and answered. Well, Hokage-sama, Naruto is energetic, loud and kind of unruly. He does his homework as often as he doesn't and every now and then he skips out with the other boys. He's a bit of a slacker and a loudmouth at times. At times I wonder if the academy is the best place for him. Hiruzen looked up at that, just in time to see the instructor hide a frown. Uruka. He sighed. Are you certain it is the teacher in you saying that, or the part that knows of Naruto's burden? Uruka looked highly offended for a moment, but Hiruzen gave him a hard look and continued before he could speak. He is just a boy, Uruka. Despite what he holds, or rather because of it actually, Naruto is just a lonely boy. I would think you would sympathize with that feeling. With a guilty look, the scarred Chunin bowed his head and Hiruzen went back to inspecting the test he was holding. It was a low blow and he felt no joy in dealing it, but sometimes you needed to go low for something to sink in. For a while after that things were silent again, but this time Uruka was the one to break it. Teaching Naruto is difficult, but I am not blameless. I try to see a boy, Hokage-sama, but sometimes I see my mother. A burning village. I know that there is more than to him than what is sealed inside of Naruto, and I will work harder to see that more often. He looked up again, determination burning in his eyes. I hope you will understand that it will take time, Hokage-sama, but I will try not to fail again. There was no failure, you simply stumbled at hurdle. We all do at times. All we can do is what you have stated you plan to do and try. Nobody can ask more. The old man answered with a kind smile. He blew out a ring of smoke and held out one of the tests to Uruka. Channel chakra through that, could you? Confused, the Chunin accepted the paper and concentrated for a moment. To his surprise, the entire test burst into flames and quickly burned up. Hokage-sama, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, he stammered incredulously as he brushed the smoldering ashes off his legs. I don't know what happened. Hiruzen frowned at the ashes and began to separate Naruto's test into two piles. Sadly, you proved my theory, Uruka-kun. The test I just handed you was made out of chakra paper. In fact, it appears all of these are too. He tapped the larger of the two piles. Uruka shook his head quickly, as if literally trying to shake off the confusion. What? That doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone print a test onto chakra paper? Determining chakra nature isn't even in the curriculum. Hiruzen frowned and held up one of the tests. While it is rarely employed, chakra paper has another use. We use it to test what chakra natures we have affinity for, but this only possible because the paper in question is very easy to channel chakra into. This very fact also makes it so that any jutsu placed on it that does not damage the paper remains for much longer than on other material. This makes it very suitable for genjutsu. Uruka muttered with a look of dawning horror. But, surely the instructors, he grit his teeth and tried to rein in his anger. We don't teach much genjutsu beyond dispelling it, and, even if we did, nobody in Naruto's class is anywhere near that age. That only leaves the instructors. Hiruzen nodded sadly and handed Uruka the test at the top of the larger pile. The technique itself has worn off, but you can still feel a bit of it. Complex, subtle, beyond an academy student, no matter the age. While Uruka glared down at the paper, Hiruzen leaned back in his seat with a contemplative look. He took a puff and then glanced at the corner of the room. Inu. Without a sound, a dog-masked Anbu dropped down from the ceiling. Hokage-sama? He asked, brushing back spiky white hair. The man was dressed no differently from the other Anbu, and only a small mark on the left side of his mask denoted his rank as captain. I want you to send people to gather up the academy's instructors. Pull them out of their beds if you must. Force is authorized if you are met with resistance. If Hiruzen hadn't worked with the Anbu captain for so long, he would have thought his orders had gone unheard, as the man didn't so much as twitch to acknowledge them. As it was, he knew the shinobi was simply going over every single aspect of his orders as fast as he could. Looking underneath the underneath, as he liked to put it. Ibiki, then, the captain finally drawled. Hiruzen considered it for a moment, puffing on his pipe and drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. No, that's a bit much, I think. Wake up one of the Yamanaka interrogators. Being Hokage came with a lot of unpleasant duties, so he would rather not add to them by sending Konoha shinobi to be tortured by their comrades. Besides, while their actions were awful and he would see them pay, he could hardly call it treason. Inu nodded his understanding and signaled 2 more Anbu down before they all vanished. This day did not seem as long just a little while ago. Hiruzen mused as he dragged his hand down his face. When he turned his attention back to Iruka, he found the instructor still trapped somewhere between outrage and shock. What now? Iruka muttered. How are we supposed to fix this? The damage this could have done to his education. I mean, it's a good thing we caught it fairly early, but this will still have messed up Naruto's understanding of the basics. The Hokage nodded and put down his pipe. If we are to fire instructors after this whole fiasco, I cannot ask you or any of the innocent instructors to split your time between classes and helping Naruto catch up. You'll all be busy enough. Do not fret, Iruka-kun. I will find someone. The question is just who would be best. Iruka nodded, not entirely satisfied with that. In a way, he would have liked to be the one to do it. It could be a good way to learn to see Naruto as his own person, and he felt like, by not noticing this, he had failed the boy as his sensei in a big way. The Hokage was right, though. He was certain they would be out a few instructors after the investigation, and that meant the remaining ones would have to divide the unattended classes between them. Odds were they would be rather busy for a while. Still, he thought, as he straightened in his seat. If I can't help, I can do my best to find someone who can. He rubbed his chin. I think it would be best to pick someone who's not too fond of traditional teaching. Naruto's good at the physical stuff, but put him in a lecture and only Shikamaru Nara will fall asleep more quickly. Hiruzen nodded, lost in thought. I agree. It also needs to be someone who he can look up to. He's got a role model in the 4th Hokage, considering he tends to go on about him, but a living one would be good too. Perhaps someone with a connection to him, or who can easily make one. He reached for his pipe again and his finger brushed against the mission folders, bringing them to his attention once more. A connection, of course. How could I have forgotten? It's not a direct one, but that might be even better. Yes, she would be good. They would both benefit from that, I believe. The return of Inu snapped both men out of their thoughts. Mission in progress, Hokage-sama. They are being rounded up and a few Yamanaka interrogators have been woken up and told mind walking is restricted during the interrogations, for now. The captain stated in an emotionless drawl. The Hokage nodded. Thank you, Inu, he said, without turning to address the Anbu captain as he took up his position in the shadows once more. Well, Iruka-kun, I think we've had quite the talk, all things considered. At least I have someone in mind for Naruto now. Iruka opened his mouth to ask who, but a soft knock cut him off. Hokage-sama, Yumi said as she stepped into the office. Outpost 3 has just sent a report saying Mitarashi's team passed them not too long ago. The Hokage brightened at the little bit of good news. It had been quite the heavy evening, so far. Ah, thank you Yumi. Their status? A bit banged up, but fine, apparently. Hiruzen nodded and turned an apologetic smile on Iruka. I'm sorry, Iruka-kun, I don't mean to throw you out. Iruka chuckled softly and stood up out of the chair. No worries, Hokage-sama. I doubt Anko would be happy if she had to wait to debrief. He had absolutely no desire to be in the same room as the unstable Tokubetsu Junin. That woman scared the crap out of him. Hiruzen waited until the scar-faced Chunin pulled the door shut behind him before turning to his secretary again. Yumi, could you please grab Hoshiko-san's file for me? I want to check something before they arrive. The slender brunette nodded and made a small note on her clipboard. Of course, sir. She'd long ago learned not to bother asking why the Hokage needed things. Half of his reasons she barely understood and the others he wouldn't tell her about to minimize safety risks. She walked out and came back after only a few minutes with a simple brown folder with the kanji for fire and an ID number on the front. Hiruzen immediately opened it and began to read, flipping through the shinobi's accomplishments. What he planned to ask was something most would consider a chore, so he had to make sure it had a clear benefit. It wasn't long before his reading was interrupted when someone literally threw his door open. Anko Mitarashi and team return. A husky female voice announced obnoxiously loudly. Hiruzen sighed and slid the folder into a drawer. He'd found what he was looking for, but meetings with Anko tended to be a bit draining. The grinning woman strode purposely into his office, tossing a ceiling scroll up and down in her hand. Her violet hair was done up in a spiky, fan ponytail and her bangs framed her face. She wore, very little, in fact. A trenchcoat a shade of brown lighter than her eyes, a mesh bodysuit that reached from her neck to her thighs, an orange miniskirt and gray shin guards. If not for the shallow cut on her left cheek, it would have been impossible to determine she'd just returned from a mission. Behind her followed two men, both wearing Chunin flak jackets and appearing slightly singed. Both had long hair, but the first man's hair was spiky and black while the second had dark hair that covered his right eye. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow at the two and laced his fingers together. Azumo, Kotetsu, what happened this time? Azumo looked away sheepishly while Kotetsu grumbled under his breath and pulled on his black spikes. Hiruzen had to bite back a laugh as he watched the pair. The two always seemed to come back from their missions with some sort of hilariously embarrassing injuries. Hiruzen had come dangerously close to losing his cool when Guy had briefed him on how Kotetsu had tripped in a battle with an enemy shinobi and taken a rather literal buttload of senbon. I did warn them, Hokage-sama. The last person to enter the room said. Her voice was soft and low and laced with a hint of amusement. The girl was very tall for her age, standing at a few inches over the rest of her team. Beyond that, it was hard to determine much about her. She seemed to have a nice body, but it was hard to be sure, because she literally covered up from head to toe. The girl wore a Chunin flak jacket, but a modified one with attached long, gray sleeves and a hood of the same color. Underneath the hood he could see the edge of a black headband with silver flames and the plate of her Hittite had been sewn into her left sleeve. Loose blue pants, bound at ankles, covered her legs. A blade with a guard-less black hilt was strapped to her back. She wore a pauldron on her right shoulder and bracers on both arms, all of which were dark green and bore a golden, burning crown. Fingerless gloves covered her hand and the lower half of her face went hidden behind a face mask. Between the mask and her headband, only a thin strip of skin around her bright red eyes was visible. Only if you looked there or at her bare fingers could you see that her skin was darker than any of the other shinobis in the room. Ah, of course. Members of your clan are always a bit of a friendly fire hazard, Hoshiko-san. Hiruzen said with a wry grin. It's not Hikari's fault. Anko protested, gesturing at Azumo and Kotetsu. She told us the reach of her jutsu. Tweedledum and Tweedlemoron just found shelter on a building where they stored explosives. Hey! Both of the scorched Chunin cried as they turned to glare at her, but Anko did her best to look innocent and ignored them. Of course, Anko trying to seem innocent just made her look more devious and Hiruzen couldn't quite keep in a laugh this time. My, that certainly is unfortunate. I take it everything else went well. Anko beamed and put the scroll she'd been playing with down on the desk. As ordered, a bunch of dead bandits in a scroll. Want fries with that? He ignored the last part and inspected the scroll for a moment. Very good. The camp? Hikari shrugged and chuckled under her breath. Probably still on fire. Should stay that way for a day or two. The Hokage asked a few more questions about the mission, before he decided to move on. Well then, I imagine anything else will probably be in your report, Anko. You all probably want to head home for the night. Azumo looked immensely relieved at that and mumbled something about guard duty, earning him an elbow to the ribs from his friend. You all did good. Go get some rest. Oh, not you, Hikari. I'd like to speak to you for a moment. The dusky-skinned Chunin paused on her way to the door and nodded slowly. All right. Good night, guys. Good working with you, Hoshiko. Azumo said with a small wave. We didn't get much chance, so come slack off with me at the gate sometime, yeah. It gets bore urk. Kotetsu added, before his partner dragged him out by the back of his shirt, lecturing him all the way out of the office and down the stairs. Anko lingered for a moment, uncertainly glancing between the Hokage and Hikari. Was there something you wanted to ask Hikari about the mission, sir? Hiruzen shook his head and smiled calmly at her. No, just something I would like her help with if possible. Anko still looked a bit uncertain and Hikari looked back at her, face mask twitching in a way Hiruzen had quickly learned meant that she was smiling. Anko, it's fine. Go home, yeah, don't you have children to eat in the morning? They are the tastiest when they're still groggy, Anko mused with a wide grin. She walked out with a wave, calling back over her shoulder. Still on for lunch, right? Yes, so long as you realize I'm not making ing dango again, Anko. Learn to appreciate the food of the gods, you heathen. She threw the door shut behind her and Hiruzen laughed as he gestured for Hikari to take a seat. My apologies. I didn't realize you were together. I won't keep you from each other long. The covered-up Chunin choked on her own spit and nearly fell out of her seat, coughing loudly. It's not like that. Anko's a friend. She just comes over a lot. Hiruzen gave her a bemused look and what little of Hikari's face turned red as she blushed. And not like that. I have a boyfriend. I like to cook. Apparently I make ungodly awesome dango. Hiruzen made a noise of understanding and pulled out the file. It was probably best not to embarrass the girl too much, though poking the more serious shinobi until they reacted was always fun. The fact that he was the Hokage and, therefore, nobody would call him on it just made it better. I would like you to read this, please. He said, handing her Naruto's records. She gave the file a confused look, but dutifully accepted it and began reading over the various papers inside. Meanwhile, Hiruzen took the time to study the kunoichi before him. Up close he could see her face mask had darkened with blood in a way that suggested that took a mean punch to the mouth and a thin rivulet of blood down her arm, over her gloved right hand. Mostly he focused on her eyes. Red, piercing, and seemingly capable of looking deep inside whoever they looked at, now narrowed in determined concentration. He could still remember them big and filled with angry tears, not all that long ago. He always felt a strange mix of pride and sadness when he looked at the girl. Konoha really seemed to produce young prodigies that would go far as shinobi. In recent years he'd caught himself thinking the word got thrown around a bit too freely at times, but with Hikari he couldn't deny it was fitting. Despite not graduating the academy early, largely because her father had intended to keep further pressure off of her in school, she had been the rookie of the year by a mile. Even before that she'd shown remarkable skill with her clan's specialty and Kekkei Genkei at a very early age, and the fact that she made Chunin less than 4 months after leaving the academy only served to prove that her skill wasn't restricted to the classroom. Still, he had to pity the girl at times. She was so young and yet she was trying to prove so much. The situation she found herself in with her clan was a truly terrible one, and it didn't seem to be one that would resolve itself quickly. Of course there was also the fact that her family situation meant quite a few shinobi were uncomfortable working with her and that she ran a lot of solo missions. Too many, he felt. When I think about it, I suppose it's not strange that she bonded with Anko. Hikari reached up to run a hand through her hair as she read, pushing back her hood in the process. Her hair was dark green and short, littered with red highlights which matched her eyes. She kept it styled into a pixie cut and it spilled over her headband slightly on the right. Without the shadows of her hood, it became clear she had a scar running from somewhere at the center of her forehead to her nose. Is there a reason you're making me? She paused when she reached the last test and eyed it quizzically. Sir, I think this might have been tampered with. Hiruzen nodded. Indeed it has. In fact quite a few have been. He settled into his chair and began to explain the day's events, watching the girl's eyes narrow as she learned of the very deliberate sabotage by the instructors. Hokage-sama, that's terrible and all, but I'm not sure why I'm here if all of this has been found out already. She muttered, glancing down at the test again. Hiruzen grinned and put her file on the desk. Well, the academy will clearly be going through a bit of a reorganization soon, so I can't ask one of the instructors to take time out to help Naruto catch up. Therefore I would like you to tutor him for a while. Her body language all but screamed surprise and Hikari's jaw worked under her mask. Sir, you want me to tutor Uzumaki Naruto? I'm no instructor. Hiruzen stood up out of his seat and walked over to the window. I am aware of this. While I would expect you to at least help him with the more theoretical class work, I think Naruto will always be better at the practical side of things, so you'd best focus on that. Chakra control in particular, I would imagine. He folded his hands at his back, watching the lights in the village go out one by one as people went to bed. Hikari, you are an amazing kunoichi for your age. Do you realize how quickly you secured your promotion? The green-haired teenager crossed her arms under her chest and shrugged. People were promoted when they were younger than me. Hell, people graduated when they were younger than me. Hiruzen looked at her reflection in the window and shook his head. Many of the cases you are referring to occurred in less than peaceful times. War has a way of fast-tracking the promising students, Hikari. Don't compare apples with oranges. He turned back to her and gave the kunoichi a stern look. Like many of your clan members, the amount of chakra you have is astounding and you have learned to use it effectively. Your skill with your clan's jutsu and kekkei genkei is truly admirable and you have exceeded many older shinobi at your area of expertise. He counted his points off on his fingers as he listed them. Naruto looks up to strong people, so that will appeal to him. Furthermore, you are responsible, punctual and professional, which I hope will rub off on him a little. With each of her better attributes the Hokage listed, the girl seemed to sit up a little straighter. That is kind of you to say, Hokage-sama. However, with all due respect, but I think I would be wasting my time helping this kid. Being a tutor is hardly part of the plan, she said, shaking her head. Besides, maybe this is better suited to someone who actually wants to be an instructor later. Like I said, it's just not in my plan. Hiruzen chuckled and stroked his beard. Ah, yes, your plan. Junin at 18 in 2 years, Anbu at 19 and then on to Junin commander eventually, right? He couldn't say he was entirely surprised that she'd responded like that. Hikari valued her career, perhaps a bit more than was healthy. Still, he'd prepared for this. Well, I suppose it was a good thing I wasn't done then. Inu. The dog-masked Anbu appeared once more and Hiruzen beckoned him over to the desk. Inu, I'm certain you remember Operation Wildfire. Please recount the last part of your report to me. The Anbu nodded and clasped his hands at his back as he began to speak. Due to poor intelligence we were unprepared for the sheer range and speed of the target's kinjutsu and lost Keiru and Raiyan in the first minutes of contact. We changed tactics and kept the target occupied until we were joined by Mitarashi Anko, Gekko Hayate and Hoshiko Hikari. He paused and turned so he was looking directly at Hikari when he continued. Hoshiko-san's excellently executed, large-scale techniques, speed and improvisation wound up saving more than of us and made her instrumental in taking down the target. Given her mission record and her performance on this mission, I highly recommend promoting Hoshiko-san to Tokubetsu Junin in preparation for an eventual placement in Anbu. Judging by the way her mask had stretched out and her eyes had widened, Hikari's jaw had all but hit the floor. But, really. The white-haired Anbu shrugged. Ma, don't think too much of it. I just gave my opinion. And I do not agree. Not entirely. Hiruzen added. Your drive is admirable, but you are too focused on your career. I can send you on month-long missions and you'll be right back here for a new one the day after you return, just to prove you can. Whether you want to prove it to me or your clan is irrelevant. Furthermore, you work solo far too much. He flipped her file open and pointed at a list of her completed missions. I can't deny that you've mastered some powerful jutsu, but you need to learn to utilize them in a way that leaves your team capable of assisting. At the very least, don't make the jutsu a danger to them as they were today. He continued sternly. While I certainly understand your reasoning behind working alone, nothing will improve if you avoid your allies. My Junin need to be able to lead. To know the people under their command. Even ANBU's greatest strength is their ability to act as a unit even while apart. Hiruzen sighed and shook his head. Hikari, meanwhile, had stiffened in her seat with her hands curled into fists and her eyes blazing with anger. With their bright red color, it was honestly rather frightening, but Hiruzen had looked into the angry faces of far more terrible opponents. You have so much potential. The aging Hokage lamented. But I think you don't even know what you're fighting for at times. There's no passion when you talk about this goal of yours. Just a drive, anger. Sometimes it's just like talking to that girl who barged into my office in angry tears only a few years ago. It just makes me wonder, why do you fight, Hikari? Beyond the anger driving you, why is it so important to keep rushing forward as you have been? She continued to glare at the Hokage for a few minutes, but she didn't answer. Finally, the teenager scoffed loudly, turning her angry gaze to her lap. Either she had no good answer to give, or she didn't feel like sharing the ones she did have. A bit of both, probably. The old man thought as he stood up out his seat again. He walked around the desk and placed a hand on Hikari's shoulder, prompting her to look up. You're only young once, Hikari, and shinobi have to grow up so quickly anyway. I can't say I wouldn't be angry in your position, but don't make it all about that. It won't lead anywhere good and you'll miss out on important opportunities. He squeezed her shoulder gently and smiled down at her. For example, you could miss out on an opportunity to take a tutoring mission and strike a deal concerning your promotion. Hikari's head snapped up so quickly Hiruzen was almost certain he heard her neck crack. Don't get too excited. I'll promise you this. You tutor Naruto for 2 years. Not constantly, of course, as you'll probably want to take missions every now and then, but at least in the first year I want you to spend a few days a week with him. At the end of the 2 years, if Naruto's results are good and I see improvement in you, I will promote you to Tokubetsu Junin. Hiruzen smiled as he watched the young Kunoichi's eyes widen in surprise. Not quite your plan, but I think it would be good for you to slow down a bit. The green-haired Kunoichi's face kept switching back in between hope and hesitation as he looked up at the Hokage. That is, she paused to clear her throat and steady her voice before she started again. That is quite an offer, Hokage-sama. You seem to believe I'll change a lot in 2 years. Hiruzen chuckled and patted her shoulder before he walked back around to his side of the desk. I'm always amazed by how young people think they'll never change when they are the most dynamic people around. Besides, I think you'll be amazed by the effect Naruto will have on you. At least he hoped she would, because part of him could see her dropping him from the monument too. Hikari considered her options for a moment, chewing on an already split lip beneath her mask. On the one hand, she still felt she would be wasting her time as a tutor, but it was clear that the Hokage badly wanted her to do this. Why she still wasn't sure, because she'd probably make a shit role model, but arguing really hadn't gotten her anywhere. Besides, she now had a clear chance at promotion. The downside to that being that it went against a plan that had been in place since the very first time she'd activated her Kekkei Genkei. A plan she'd had for most of her life, but it was only a 2-year delay, and maybe she could cut down on that if she did well. Well, there is one more factor. She thought, glancing at Naruto's file. Going to such lengths just to sabotage a kid you didn't like was a shit thing to do. Could she really say she was much better when presented with the chance? No, directly asked to help, she decided her own career was more important. The kid was an Uzumaki too. Probably not a direct relation, considering the hair, but he still had the name. She let out a long, weary sigh and nodded. I am angry, Hokage-sama. In fact, I probably won't be done being angry for some time. However, if that anger becomes a hindrance rather than a drive, then what's the point? She chuckled humorlessly and shook her head. I still think you're overestimating the effect this kid and I will have on one another, but you know him better than I do. I'll help the kid. She put the file down on his desk and stood up, stretching. You'd better be ready to promote me 2 years from now, though. She decided to leave out the, if not sooner, for now. Wonderful. Hiruzen beamed. I'll ensure Naruto comes by tomorrow so you two can meet. Please be here after the academy closes for the day. Oh, and I'm putting a limit of 1 per month on your solo missions. Consider it my way of helping you deal with teamwork. Hikari's right eye twitched in annoyance, but she did an admirable job of keeping her tone neutral as she bowed and turned to leave. Of course, Hokage-sama. Good night. To you as well, Inu, and thank you again for the recommendation. See you tomorrow, Hikari. I'm sure you'll hit it off well. Hiruzen said. Hikari paused with her hand on the door and chuckled. Well, we do have one thing in common. She put her hood up again, revealing a large section of her flak jacket, and the dark blue shirt she wore underneath had been cut away to reveal part of her upper back. There, carved directly into her dusky skin, was part of a large, incredibly complex ceiling array with a hint of the spiral at the center that peeked just over the bottom edge of the gap in her jacket and shirt. Both of us wouldn't be where we are without the Uzumaki clan. Hiruzen sighed loudly, something he had been doing a lot in the past 2 days. He adjusted the wide hat on his head and took in the absolutely ruined training ground. A massive spider web of cracks fanned out from the center, as if something massive had dropped down on it from great height. 2 narrow scorch marks further marred the clearing, one on the very edge and the second was closer to the center. Not far from that mark lay an unconscious Naruto Uzumaki, breathing quickly but apparently unharmed. Crouched over him, protecting his body with her own, was his new tutor Hikari Hoshiko. Her condition was a little less favorable than Naruto's. She too was breathing quickly, but she also had a few fresh bruises and shallow cuts. If the dirt and pebbles in her hair was any indication, she'd bounced along the ground a few times. The skin on her arms and fingertips appeared burned in places, though thankfully those didn't seem too bad. The tip of Kakashi's tanto was pressing into the side of her neck. Another Anbu member was at her side with his blade held up for a downward thrust. Not that he was in any position to follow through, as with the hand not supporting her weight she was holding a machete to his genitals. Hiruzen winced reflexively at that. No man wanted a blade there. Or just in the general area of it, really. Well, it seems Naruto has had quite the eventful first day. The Hokage remarked calmly as he stood directly across from the crouched Hikari. I think it would be best if you lowered the blade, Hikari. Her dark red eyes narrowed at him in a truly impressive glare and the young Chunin shook her head. With all due respect, no. They can step back. I'm not lowering anything. The Anbu at her side shifted his balance and immediately regretted his action as Hikari raised her blade just a little higher. Okay. Hiruzen said easily before turning to the Anbu. You are all dismissed. If there are further issues, I'm certain Inu and I can handle it. The order was obeyed without question as all the Anbu took a step back, one of them far more carefully than the others, and vanished. It was only when Kakashi sheathed his tanto and joined the Hokage at his side that Hikari lowered her machete and dropped back on her butt with a groan. Fuck. That probably took about 10 years off my life, yeah. She muttered as he ran a slightly trembling hand through her hair. She hadn't had much of a plan beyond, threatened to turn the asshole who got too close into a eunuch. I'd say you're very stress resistant if it only took 10 off. Hiruzen chuckled. He brushed some of the sharp, broken stones aside and sat down across from the teenager. Now, how about you tell me all about it? Almost immediately Hikari's eyes narrowed again in anger. I think I'm due an explanation first, Hokage-sama. She glanced at the unconscious blonde. Hiruzen followed her gaze and nodded with a grim expression. It had been such a nice day up until now. Flashback. Are you sure about the amount? That seems like a lot of spice. The Hokage muttered as he scribbled something down. From where she stood near his desk, leaning against the wall, Hikari nodded. Yes, sir. Don't worry, it seems like a lot, but if you let the meat soak it up, it's not so bad. Her face mask twitched in a way that Hiruzen had quickly learned meant she was smiling. Besides, there's always the rice if it's still too much for you. Hiruzen chuckled. Well, I'm an old man. I have no intention of getting killed by my own food. The girl had clearly been a bit tense about this assignment when she arrived, and he had decided to calm her down a bit by finding something to talk about. Food seemed like a safe bet, and he was always happy to pick up a recipe, since his late wife hadn't been much of an asset in the kitchen and he barely knew pork from beef himself. There was a sharp knock at the door, and at his invitation it swung open to reveal an Anbu member with dark hair tied in a short ponytail and a weasel mask. Hokage-sama, I'm here with Uzumaki-san as requested. As if on cue, a blonde blur shot by him and ran up to the ornate desk. Hey, Gigi, is my tutor ready for me? Hello, Naruto. Hiruzen gave the boy a smile and then turned his attention back to the weasel-masked Anbu. Thank you. I'm sure you expected more exiting work on your first day. Did you stop to talk to your brother? The man shifted uncomfortably and shook his head. I thought it unwise to do so on duty, sir. The Hokage frowned for a moment, but then nodded. The mask comes off, my boy. Trust me when I say that you'll wish for moments to stop and talk to people soon enough. At any rate, thank you again. I'm sure your captain is eager to get you used to your duties. Dismissed. The Anbu nodded and vanished, allowing the Hokage to turn his attention back to the hyper-blonde at his desk. Naruto, allow me to introduce you to Hikari Hoshiko. She will be tutoring you for the foreseeable future. He gestured at the young kunoichi and she greeted Naruto with a quick jerk of her head. Nice to meet ya, kid. Whoa. Naruto's eyes went wide as he craned his head up to look at the tall teen. You're really tall. He bounded over to her and smiled widely. So, you're gonna help me get caught up so I can take the old man's hat, huh? Hikari chuckled. She had to give it to the kid, he certainly had the right mindset. Well, I don't know about that, but I am going to be helping you, yes. You've got your stuff from school, right? She asked. Naruto nodded vigorously, patting a beat-up messenger bag at his side, and Hikari pushed off from the wall. Then I think we should get started, yeah. Unless there was something else. She looked to Hiruzen, but the old man shook his head. No, I think you're right. The sooner you get started the better. He walked around his desk and placed a hand on Naruto's head. Naruto, Hikari is one of our most promising young kunoichi, so listen to her well. Is there anything you'd like to ask before I let you two get started? Immediately the blonde started to rattle of questions. How old are you? What's with your outfit? Are you cold? Can I hold your sword? Can you teach me to use one? Have you been on many cool missions? Can you teach me cool jutsu? He barely took a breath between questions. Wide-eyed, Hikari turned from the genin questioning her to the Hokage, who was concealing his amusement rather poorly. Kami kid, take a breath, yeah. She waited for Naruto to stop babbling and ran a hand through her green hair. I might teach you jutsu, if you do well. I'd rather not talk about my missions. I might teach you to use a sword too, but you can't hold mine. You'd cut your hand off. I'm not talking about the outfit, and I'm 16. She saw him gearing up to continue his questioning, not bothered by her outright ignoring her short answers, and quickly flicked him in the forehead. Oh, shut up, yeah. Naruto pouted a little. Ah, come on. I have way more to ask, and I'd be real careful with your sword. And she flicked him again and he glared at her. This was so not over. Hiruzen chuckled softly. Well then, I'm sure you can ask those on the way. I fear I have other meetings. Naruto nodded and grabbed Hikari's hand, trying to drag her out of the room while. Come on, let's go already. He began dragging her out of the room, and the tall Kunoichi managed to shoot the Hokage one last, slightly overwhelmed, look before the door slammed shut behind them. Over here should be good, right? Naruto asked as he stepped out onto a training field near the Hokage's tower. He was nowhere near experienced enough in body language to tell, but Hikari sounded a little surprised when she spoke. Yeah, didn't even know they had training fields here. He wasn't exactly surprised, considering he had only found this field while hiding on his birthday. The fact that it was a bit beat up, with cracks running through the field and rusted weapons littered here and there, probably meant that it was quite old. Naruto didn't care though. He eagerly sat down by a stump at the edge of the field and dumped his books on the floor. Hikari sat down across from him and eyed the old, weathered books for a moment before she spoke. Alright, let's figure out how we're gonna. I already thought of that. Naruto shouted as he jumped to his feet and unrolled an absurdly long scroll. I worked it all out. I'll probably need to get warm after class so we can start with something to get me going. Then of course, taijutsu. I'm gonna kick everyone's. Then we can rest a bit while you teach me about jutsu and. Hikari warily nudged the unrolled section of the scroll. How long was that thing anyway? A foot. Kid, I don't think. Then maybe dinner. Have you been to Ichiraku's? Doesn't matter. Then we practice jutsu for a bit. Kid, seriously. And then maybe some training with traps and. Oh, shut up. Hikari's leg shot out without warning and knocked both of his out from underneath him. Naruto barely had time to squeak in surprise before he landed flat on his back and all the air abruptly left his lungs. He blinked in confusion and found himself staring up at the tip of a dull gray machete with a black hilt that would have speared him right in the head if Hikari had followed through. There, taijutsu lesson over. The green-haired Kunoichi growled as she sheathed her blade. You're dead. She sat back down and glared at Naruto while he gasped for air. You're a terrible teacher. He croaked as he sat up, rubbing his back. I don't feel like I learned anything from that. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He'd learned he stood no chance of beating her. He hadn't even seen the kick coming. And people say learning something new never hurts. Hikari ignored the remark and reached forward to pick up one of his books. Listen, yeah, Hokage-sama himself told that my main job is to help you with this. She waved the textbook. So, no matter what, this is the first thing we do when we meet up, yeah. The little blonde slumped and pouted. But it's boring, he protested. I don't wanna have to go over all of it again. He didn't even really understand why they had to go over it all again. It wasn't his fault that the instructors had sabotaged him. Why did he have to do extra work because of it? Hikari watched him go from pouting and bratty to moody and angry, glaring at the ground, and sighed. Maybe she should cut the kid a break. Yeah, I suppose it is kinda boring, but you don't want to let your classmates beat you in this, do you? The kid shook his head and she smiled behind her face mask. Then you gotta do it, even if it's. Besides, it can be useful. What if Hokage-sama ever sends you to deal with a target in, say, Suna, and you get lost because you don't know the terrain? Naruto's head shot up and he stared at her with wide eyes. What? Like a person? Why would Gigi do something like that? Hikari raised an eyebrow, though with her face covered as it was the action almost went unnoticed. Naruto was definitely old enough for the instructors to have put him and his classmates through the exercise of killing small creatures to get the kids prepared for killing people. So what was the problem? Kid, why do you want to be a shinobi? Confused by the sudden change in topic, Naruto pointed at the Hokage monument. I'm going to be the best Hokage there ever was and make everyone acknowledge me, Dadbeo. I'm gonna be just like Gigi and the fourth Hokage and keep the village safe. Well, they've all killed people. Hikari said, indicating the monument with a jerk of her head. So have I, though probably not nearly as many. Shinobi are not the good guys, kid. She watched his spirits dampen and chuckled softly as she reached out and ruffled his hair. Well, not always anyway. We do a lot to help people too, and of course we protect this place, but there are very few shinobi without blood on their hands. It's best if you learn that early on. The blonde gave her the evil eye for a moment as he tried to straighten his hair. You've killed people? He asked eventually, giving up on salvaging his hair. I specialize in capture and assassination missions. She answered, playing with the bracer on her right arm. It's why I said I wasn't going to talk about those. It's not something a kid should hear. She chuckled when he grumbled about not being a kid. I never really thought about it. Naruto added hesitantly. I guess it makes sense, but it's not very easy to take in. Hikari finished his sentence and Naruto nodded. She could see where the kid was coming from, even if this wasn't something that bothered her too much. Besides, she was going to be spending time with him anyway, so she could always see about getting him to move past it. Look, it's something you won't have to worry about for quite some time yet. She reached for his hair again, but he smacked her hand and she laughed softly. Talk to your teachers. I'm sure you're not the first kid to have reservations about this part of the job. In fact, it's a good thing that you do. She leaned back on her hands and closed her eyes as she basked in the light of the slowly setting sun. Sometimes people have to die, but that doesn't mean we have to go around wasting life. When she got no response, she cracked an eye open and found Naruto still pondering things. Well, we've wasted enough time, I think. Let's get started, yeah. Naruto nodded and listlessly nudged one of his books. Are we really only going to do stuff from the textbooks? Is he still on that? Hikari resisted the urge to roll her eyes and decided to compromise. The kid had gotten a rough deal, after all. How about this? Each day we meet up, we start with the textbooks, and if you work hard, I'll help you do some practical stuff. How's that? She was nearly knocked back when Naruto shot up and hugged her. Really? You're the best, Hikari Nichan. He yelled, a wide grin on his face, and his earlier reservations pushed to the back of his mind, though not forgotten. I'm gonna work really hard, you'll see. First off, I'm not your sister, she said as she peeled Naruto off with a slightly annoyed look. And secondly, you bet Yorio are gonna work hard. I'll make sure of that. Now come on. She shoved a book in his hands. You're gonna answer the questions at the end of chapter 1 and explain to me why you gave that answer. Naruto soon learned that his new tutor had not been kidding when she said she would ensure he worked hard. For every question he had to explain to her in detail why he thought his answer was correct. If it was, she praised him briefly and they moved on, but if it wasn't, she made him really think. If he couldn't come up with a new answer on his own, she gave him a hint about where he'd gone wrong and make him look it up in the book. If he still wasn't sure after that, she stopped the questions for a moment to explain it to him before they continued. She didn't let him skip any of the questions either, even making him do the ones that were never assigned in class. Soon enough, Naruto felt like his brain was melting, and as he got more tired he became sloppier and started making more mistakes, meaning he would have to answer the question again. They went through one chapter, then another. When she suggested doing the next chapter as well, Naruto groaned loudly and slumped forward onto the book. Hikari laughed softly and nudged him. All right, I get the message. Naruto didn't stir, but she had an idea she was sure would get him up. We'll only do one more thing before we call it quits for today, yeah. He lifted his head just enough to look at her and she smiled. It's something that doesn't involve books, I promise. Hikari could only stand the books for so long too, after all. It had given her a good impression of the kid's strong and weak points when it came to theory, though. He wasn't dumb, not really, just hasty. When he thought about it, he often managed to answer correctly, but it was clear he mostly worked by instinct rather than what the book told him. This was fine, except for when those instincts were just wrong. Sadly, it was also clear that she'd have quite a bit to do for the next few days, as she could already tell where his instructors' interference had damaged his understanding of the basics. That clearly made the more complicated scenarios harder to understand for him, and he was far too energetic to spend a long time sitting still and thinking about it. Still, nothing we can't fix, right? She pulled him up, dragged him over to the center of the field and handed him a leaf. Naruto gave the leaf a thoroughly unimpressed look, before he turned his attention to Hikari again. This is a leaf. Hikari nodded absently as she searched through the pouches in her jacket. Yes, and it's central to an exercise you probably won't be doing in the academy for at least a few weeks. Aha! She pulled out an old lighter and lit the center of the leaf. Right, now use your chakra to keep from burning the entire leaf. Like a barrier that'll fuel the flame, but won't let it pass. Excited about learning something before the rest of his class did, Naruto eagerly set to work. The first leaf quickly burned, though, and he was forced to let it go. The second met the same fate and the third seemed to burn slower, but he still couldn't keep it contained to the center. Cursing under his breath as he nearly burned his fingers again, Naruto dropped the leaf and accepted a new one from Hikari. I think she's laughing at me. She was, because watching Naruto grow more and more annoyed with each leaf she handed him was kinda funny. However, she was also trying to work out why he wasn't making much progress. Sure, she could sense that the kid had a lot of chakra. Way above normal. She didn't need to bother checking in more detail when they were this close. That did explain why he was having such difficulty with a chakra control exercise, but she came from a clan with pretty sizable chakra reserves and they all managed it sooner or later. She was quite proud of her own control, actually, and she could just stab anyone who reminded her that it wasn't exactly medic nin level. The kid, though, his levels feel like a pretty experienced genin. And that was just a general impression. It could actually be more. That would certainly explain the problem. He'll probably have more chakra by the time he finishes the academy than I did at that age. Just as she was pondering ways to help him with that, she noticed something. Naruto's stomach was faintly glowing. Kid, hold up a second. What? I'm trying, Naruto said, but the green-haired Kunoichi ignored him and lifted up his shirt. Hey, he tried to back away, vaguely wondering if he should be calling for an adult, but her next words froze him in place. Kid, did you know you have a seal here? She asked. Hikari lifted his shirt up a little higher and whistled softly in admiration. One hell of a seal. A seal? Naruto asked, trying to keep the leaf from burning while also bending down so he could see. A seal, yeah, Fuinjutsu, you know, Hikari muttered, frowning now. This was a containment seal. An extremely powerful one, and that was about all she could tell about it. It was extremely complicated. The fact that the kid apparently hadn't been aware of it up until now was more than a little worrying. Shit, I can see at least a dozen subseals. Why the hell would anyone put this on a kid? More importantly, what is it holding? Hikari Nichan. She looked up and found Naruto looking down at her, now actually looking a little concerned. Don't worry, kid. Just focus on the leaf while I see what this does. He nodded slowly and went back to work, while Hikari turned her attention back to his seal. It was an amazing piece of work, just from a technical standpoint. She could figure out the basic purpose of the seal and a few of the subseals. Containment, chakra suppression, and a lot of other functions besides she wasn't sure about. The young Kunoichi made a few quick hand seals and her fingers glowed black. She was never going to figure this out if she didn't give it a poke or two. Besides, I'm brilliant at this. What's the worst that could happen? She began poking and prodding at the seal, trying to figure out why it had been placed on Naruto and what it was supposed to do anyway. As she worked, though, she only grew more worried. Whoever placed this was brilliant. Not to mention strong. An absurd amount of chakra must have gone into this, and the needed control to create all these subseals must have been amazing. With each subseal she figured out, she learned that there were even more levels of subseals, all reinforcing the general design. She'd be at this for hours if she tried to crack it this way, if that was even a good idea. Naruto was trying his best not to twitch or laugh every time Hikari prodded him. He had heard Fuinjutsu mentioned in class once or twice, but he couldn't quite remember what it was used for. He certainly hadn't known that someone had placed a seal on him. Were the instructors trying to mess with him like that too? With a sigh, he continued concentrating on the leaf as the fire slowly spread out further. Getting his chakra to cooperate wasn't exactly easier with someone poking him every few seconds. Hikari was growing more and more frustrated with the seal. She started ignoring the layers upon layers of subseals and focused on the basics when she noticed something. This is Uzumaki-style sealing. If the seal existing in the first place had been worrying, this was cause for a red alert. Very few people still knew the details of this form of Fuinjutsu, and fewer still were this good at it. Unnaturally so, even. Who or what made this? Just then Naruto cursed and jerked when the fire reached his fingers and Hikari accidentally dragged a finger over two of the subseals. They flickered, their glow faded, and then the entire seal pulsed. Oh, shit. Chakra burst free with unrestrained force and hurled the green-haired Kunoichi like a ragdoll. She hit the ground hard twice and rolled to a stop right at the edge of the clearing. Okay, ow. She slowly picked herself up and tried to regain her bearings after smacking her head none too gently during her unexpected flight. And then the ground suddenly cracked between her hands. She staggered to her feet and could only stare dumbly at what she saw. Naruto was bent over, hands on his head and mouth open in a silent scream as a vortex of red and blue chakra swirled around him. The red tendrils lashed out at random as if trying to break free, and each time they struck the field they left more and deeper cracks. Oh shit, kid. She tried to run towards him, but was almost immediately forced back when one of the red tendrils lashed out at her. It smashed into the ground and immediately shot back up, trying to hit her again, but she ducked and it merely grazed her arm before it pulled back. Even that light touch caused pain to shoot through her arm, though, and she hissed as she studied the damage. The skin was bright red and sensitive to the touch. It almost felt like something between a welt and a burn. Okay, that hurts. That chakra doesn't even feel human. It took a while for that thought to fully register, and when it did, she cursed loudly. It's not human chakra. They saddled me with the village's bloody Jinchuriki. Another swipe from one of the tendrils nearly took her legs out from underneath her, and she growled in frustration. She pulled her hood over her face and crouched low, hands in the dragon seal. Enough of this, Hoshi Akari Hain. Starlight feathers, the large seal on her back glowed, two streaks of fire shot out from between her shoulders, and in a burst of speed she cleared the distance from the edge to the center of the field. Closer to Naruto, it was like walking into a hurricane, and even with the fire propelling her forward, she had to dig in her heels to keep from being pushed back. The red chakra was crawling over Naruto like a shroud, and she had to bite through the pain as she plunged a hand through it to touch his waist. If I can just undo whatever I did, she strained as hard as she could, but it was still like trying to push through thick, hot mud. She could feel her hand burning even through her gloves, but she was so close. I'm not letting this place get destroyed because I accidentally screwed up our Jinchuriki's seal and let the nine-tailed fox out. My career is not freaking ending that way. The moment she actually touched him, Naruto's head snapped up and Hikari froze for a moment. His eyes had turned blood red and his pupils had become little more than slits. He snarled at her and the tendrils of red chakra all pulled back to strike at once. Then her glowing fingers passed over the messed up part of the seal, the subseals reformed, and it was over almost immediately. The connection between the blonde and the red chakra was almost violently cut off, and his eyes quickly turned blue again, before they rolled back in his skull and he passed out. Hikari slumped over as well and wound up more or less crouched over him, the flames on her back dying out slowly. Ah, come on kid, don't be dead. She quickly felt for a pulse and breathed a sigh of relief when she felt the steady drum against her fingers. She would have had a pretty tough time looking at herself in the mirror if her mistake had wound up killing the kid. Her relief was short-lived, though, as the field was suddenly surrounded by members of Anbu. Hikari Hoshiko, a woman with a bird mask, began. You are to hand the child over to us and await debriefing. Hikari raised an eyebrow at her and crouched lower over Naruto, protectively. Right, that's one option. I was gonna go with plan B and march straight to the Hokage with the kid. Feel free to keep standing here, though. This is not a request. One of the masked shinobi shunshined over to her, but before he could bend down to pick Naruto up, he found himself with a machete pressed against something he very much did not wish to lose. Hikari glared at him and lifted the blade a little higher when it looked like his companions were about to step in. Wanna talk about those options again? Well, there's always option C. A bored-sounding voice stated right before something sharp and cold was pressed to her neck. You won't like option C. The green-haired Kunoichi's eyes widened in shock and she very slowly turned her head to find a dog-masked Anbu with spiky, white hair standing over her with the tip of his tanto pressed against her neck. She chuckled nervously as a bead of sweat rolled down her brow. Hey, well, shit. Flashback end. Quite an eventful first day for you both, then. Hiruzen muttered softly after Hikari finished recounting her version of things. I imagined you'd find Naruto a bit much to deal with, but not quite like this. Hikari glared at the Hokage and crossed her arms under her chest. That would have been far less likely had you told me just who I was working with. She turned to look at the spot where the dog-masked Anbu was looking over a still unconscious Naruto's seal. The kid's going to wake up, right? Don't worry, Hikari, Naruto is much more resilient than you know. Hiruzen said with a kind smile, following her gaze. As to why I did not inform of you of Naruto's passenger. The smile made way for a stern frown. Strong as they are, Jinchuriki are still shinobi, and a shinobi's greatest weapon is still the element of surprise. I am sorry things turned out this way, but this information is not something I hand out freely. Hikari grunted, not exactly happy with the answer but well aware that there was little she could do about it. That seal. Did the fourth do that? She waited for Hiruzen to nod and shook her head in disbelief. Unbelievable. How did he even do that? It makes my clan's seals look like Hokage-sama. The Anbu captain finally stood up from his examination and made his way back over to them with Naruto in his arms. As far as I can tell, the seal is functioning as it should be. She accidentally blocked two subseals from the overall structure and that seems to have caused a chain reaction. I see, Fuinjutsu truly is a temperamental art. Too bad Jiraiya isn't here at the moment. Hiruzen muttered as he pushed himself to his feet with a drawn-out groan. That took so much less effort back when he was still young. At any rate, I think we should let Hikari get her injuries checked out. Inu, would you be so kind as to bring Naruto home? The Anbu nodded and leapt into the trees with another word. Hikari watched him go and then climbed to her feet as well, being very careful with her injured arm. I'll swing by tomorrow, Hokage-sama. See how he is. Yes, if you could that would be great. He'll probably be a bit dazed when he wakes up. Hiruzen said, staring off into the distance in the vague direction of Naruto's apartment building. If he remembers anything, bring him by my office. If not, it's best to keep it that way. He lightly patted the young Kunoichi on the arm and couldn't help but smile when she flinched. Now go get those checked out. Yes, sir. She took to the trees as well and left Hiruzen alone on the ruined training field, stroking his beard ponderously. Now, how do I avoid the questions the council will undoubtedly ask about this incident? When Naruto woke up the following morning, he had never felt so well rested. He was not a morning person and generally spent most of the morning as a zombie, but today he felt as if someone had given him a caffeine shot right before he woke up. He jumped out of bed, eager for some breakfast, and was halfway to the kitchen before it hit him. Wait, how did I get here? He couldn't remember much about yesterday, and when he looked down he noticed that someone had taken his shoes and socks off, but hadn't bothered to strip him further before they stuck him into bed. What the hell? Oh, hey, kid. You up? He jumped when he heard a voice from the kitchen and rushed over to find Hikari with her head in one of his cupboards. Someone here seriously needs to go shopping, kid. There's nothing but ramen in here. She closed the cupboard and frowned at one of the plastic cups in her hands. Seriously, these have like no vitamins. No wonder you're short. Naruto's eye twitched. Don't you dare knock ramen in my house. It's cheap and it's the greatest food known to man. He tried jumping for his ramen, but with how much taller Hikari was he had to give up pretty quickly. Besides, this way I don't have to spend time on worrying what I'm gonna make for dinner when I go shopping. Go home and eat your own food if you hate it so much. When his words registered in his own brain, he crossed his arms and glared at the green-haired Kunoichi. Hang on a second, you broke into my house. He pointed at her dramatically. You can't just do that. Took you long enough, kid. Hikari muttered in a distracted tone as she looked around. She hadn't really thought about it before, as she'd been more concerned with how beat up the place was, but Naruto's apartment would actually be rather cramped for two people. She had just assumed that he'd be living with someone, since he clearly wasn't living in the orphanage. They seriously left a 6-year-old kid all by himself. Academy student or not, what the people? Naruto watched on in confusion as Hikari seemed to zone out right in front of him, glaring at the wall while her hands curled into fists. One of the few things he still remembered from yesterday was how she'd put him on his with no discernible effort the moment she'd gotten annoyed, so he took a step back before he spoke up. Nichan, are you okay? Hikari blinked rapidly a few times and smiled sheepishly, a hint of a blush just peeking over the edge of her face mask. Oh, sorry. I was just trying to figure out how some people think. She put his ramen down on the counter and sat down at one of the chairs at the old, creaky dinner table. And I'm not your sis. She tried to find a comfortable spot and gave Naruto a curious look. So, how's your head? My head. Naruto reached up and ran hand through his golden blonde mop. It certainly didn't feel any different and he didn't have a headache either. What happened? The last thing I remember is that stupid chakra exercise. Hikari chuckled. You didn't think it was so stupid when you heard your class wouldn't be learning it for weeks. Hikari said as she put both her feet up on the table. It creaked ominously and she quickly lifted them off again with a sheepish look. Anyway, you weren't making much progress, so I had you do a little running too and then you tripped and smashed your head on a rock. Seems like the medic nin healed it pretty well, though. Medic nin? Naruto asked, rubbing his head again. If he'd hit his head that hard, it was strange that there wasn't even a bruise. Shinobi that specialize in healing jutsu. Had them check you over, you know, just in case. She silently chastised herself for not planning further ahead. Medic nin had seemed like a great excuse for why he wasn't hurt and had still passed out when she came up with it this morning. Best to just keep talking, probably. They can heal a little scratch like yours in seconds, but sometimes it's best to let them heal the worst of the damage and wait for the rest to heal naturally. Or at least that's what she'd been told when they were wrapping her chakra-burned arm in bandages. Cool. So you could just heal stab wounds. You gotta teach me that. Naruto exclaimed, a massive grin spreading over his face as he lost himself in his fantasies. Some jerk would stick a kunai in my gut and I'd be all, oh yeah, watch this and heal myself before stabbing him with his own kunai. Note to self, do all in your power to make sure this kid never meets Anko. Hikari thought as she apprehensively watched the daydreaming blonde. She loved her slightly deranged friend, but she didn't need a younger and even more hyper copy. Hikari cleared her throat to draw Naruto's attention. It doesn't work that way, yeah. It takes really good chakra control. Hey, Naruto protested. Just because I haven't gotten that stupid leaf exercise down yet, that doesn't mean I never will. I just gotta keep practicing. Hikari chuckled and stood up, checking her watch. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. You just have an assload of chakra, kid. The more chakra you have, the harder it becomes to control. She ruffled his hair as she passed him and stepped into the hall. You have the right idea, though. Just gotta keep practicing. Anyway, I gotta leave, but first, here. She handed Naruto a small basket filled with a few Tupperware containers. I wasn't sure how you'd feel, so I made you some food just in case. She leaned over and pointed at them, explaining what was inside. Some vegetable soup. Don't look at me like that, it's healthy. This is a fruit salad and that's some ham I had left over. Oh, Naruto stammered, looking at the basket. He wasn't really getting things. Not from anyone who wasn't the Hokage anyway. Thank you, Nichan. You didn't have to. Especially the vegetable soup. He could have done without that, but still, this was probably the first time someone had actually brought him food. He looked up at her with big, blue eyes and gave her a wide smile. Really? Thanks. It's not a 5-course meal, kid. Don't sweat it, yeah. Hikari muttered, a little uncomfortable with how grateful he was for a bit of food. She could only wonder about his reaction if she'd brought him any of that ramen crap. And I'm still not your sister, kid. He put the basket down on the table and turned around to thank Hikari again, but then he saw the clock and yelped in surprise. Shit, I have school today. I'm so late. He began running back and forth in the kitchen, pulling at his hair. Oh man, Iruka-sensei's gonna kill me. I won't even be alive to graduate. Oh shit. He was brought to an abrupt stop when he tripped over Hikari's extended leg. Ow, the hell was that for? Your sensei's already aware you'll be late, kid. She nudged him with her foot as she looked at the clock. I talked to him this morning. Naruto immediately bounced up again and hugged the far taller girl. Yes, you're the best, Hikari Nichan. He hesitated for a moment and then gave her his best puppy dog eyes. Say, since you talked to Iruka-sensei, nobody would mind if I just, don't go. Right. The question was met with a stony glare and he sighed. Yeah, didn't think you'd say yes. 2 floors below, the building manager was rudely stirred from his slumber by a loud crash from above, followed by an angry female voice. Eat your breakfast and go to school, you young brat. The day after his unfortunate first tutoring session with Hikari, Naruto waited until everyone had made their way out of the class before approaching Iruka. Iruka-sensei. Could I ask you something? Iruka looked up from his desk in surprise. Normally Naruto was the first out of the door when the bell rang. Immediately he felt himself growing paranoid and he started looking in places Naruto had previously placed traps. Okay, Naruto, why are you pranking me this time? The blonde smiled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. No, that's not it, I promise. Perhaps he had been a bit too aggressive in pranking Iruka if the man thought his only possible reason for staying behind was to prank him more. Hikari Nichan told me to ask you something. Hikari. Oh, of course, you had your first tutoring session yesterday. How'd it go? Iruka asked with a smile. And of course you can ask me something if your tutor found it difficult to explain. It went pretty well, but she made me do a lot of boring bookwork. Naruto made a face to show what he thought of that. He also decided to keep the, somewhat embarrassing, fact that the session had ended with him passing out to himself. Anyway, we talked about being a shinobi and, well, killing and stuff. She said she's done that a lot, so. And you're uncomfortable with the idea of killing? Iruka asked with an understanding smile. He got little more than a shrug in reply, but he'd seen enough students work their way up to this question. That's natural, Naruto. However, I won't sugarcoat it for you. You'll probably have to kill sooner or later after graduating. Either to save yourself or your friends, to complete a mission, or to protect Konoha itself. He leaned back in his seat and toyed with a few of the papers stacked there. It's part of being a shinobi. I had trouble with it too. It's part of the reason I decided to become an instructor. I'm not cut out for field work. But you did start out doing field work, right? Naruto asked, idly scuffing his feet. Did you have to kill? Iruka nodded, a wry smile on his lips. Yup, a few times. He leaned forward and placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Look, it's not like killing rabbits like we had you all do at the start of the year. That's just to help you get used to the idea. The first time it happens, you'll probably be shaken up. However, you won't know if you're cut out for it until it happens. He squeezed the little blonde's shoulder. I always figured I was doing it to protect those dear to me and that helped. Perhaps you just need to think of it like that. Naruto looked at his teacher and nodded slowly. Right now he didn't really have that many people he'd consider dear to him. Sure, there was the Hokage and Ayame and her old man from Ichiraku's, but that was about it. The idea of one day having lots of important people to protect, though, was very appealing to the little blonde. I'll try. Thank you, Iruka-sensei. Don't mention it, Naruto. Iruka said with a grin. He stood up and stretched, before looking down at the little blonde again. What were you two talking about anyway that landed you on this topic? Hikari Nichan specializes in capture and assassination missions. Naruto answered. Iruka blinked at him in surprise for a moment, but slowly a look of dawning comprehension appeared on his face. Ooh, of course. Your tutor's from the Hoshiko clan, isn't she? The specialization in question wasn't exactly a popular one, so word got around of people who took it. Of course, that wasn't the only word going around about Hikari Hoshiko and her family, but Haruka had always written those off as nasty rumors. That kind of makes sense, then. He saw Naruto give him a questioning look and adopted his lecturing tone with a chuckle. If you want to be simple, you can identify two categories of shinobi. The first is shinobi who prefer traps and stealth in a fight. The second is shinobi who prefer to overwhelm their enemy and smash right through their guard to kill them. The Hoshiko clan is a rather extreme example of the second sort. He looked down at Naruto and grinned. A bit like you really. More wrecking ball than scalpel. They sort of have to be, as their large chakra reserve often make them easy to find. Naruto stared into the distance as he thought on what he'd been told. But you always say surprise is a shinobi's weapon of choice. Oh, they'll fight much like other shinobi. They wait for the right moment and go for blind spots just like everyone else, but the difference is just in the scale at which they fight. Iruka saw Naruto was still having trouble grasping it and chuckled. You'll understand if you ever see it. He paused uncertainly for a moment. You aren't bothered by the missions she prefers to take, right? Naruto vigorously shook his head. Of course not. Hikari Nichan's not a bad person. Sure, she'd knocked him on his ass, but she didn't treat him like most of the village did either. Yeah, she kills people, but everyone keeps telling me it's part of being a shinobi. His smile grew into a wide grin. Besides, she has to be pretty strong if she keeps completing those missions. Training with her is gonna help me become Hokage for sure. The Hokage knows how to use a clock, kid. Naruto turned around to find Hikari leaning against the doorframe, face shadowed by her hood. Hello, Yumino-san. Just picking up the kid. Naruto looked up at the clock and blushed. They had agreed to meet outside of the school about 10 minutes ago. Sorry Nichan. I lost track of time. That's probably my fault. I tend to jump all over any chance to lecture. Iruka added as she walked over to the tall kunoichi. We didn't really have time to introduce ourselves when you came by to tell me Naruto would be late. Yumi no Iruka. Nice to meet you. Hikari's red eyes darted between the extended hand and Iruka's scarred face a few times before she finally reached out and took the hand. Hoshiko Hikari. Nice to meet you too. She noticed the way Iruka's eyes lingered on the dark skin of her fingers and quickly found something else to turn his attention to. Has the kid been paying attention? Iruka smirked as he stepped back. If Naruto ever actually wants to be in class, I'll retire immediately because I'll never witness a greater miracle. He ignored the blonde's indignant shout. But at least he didn't skip. Hikari chuckled softly and beckoned Naruto over. I'll see if I can beat a work ethic into him. Come on, kid, let's go. She nodded to Iruka and walked out the door, closely followed by Naruto. Before he could close the door, Iruka called after him. Naruto, if ever wanna talk again, just let me know, alright? We'll get some ramen or something. Naruto grinned widely at the scar-faced instructor. I'll hold you to that, Iruka-sensei. He closed the door and left Iruka feeling strangely worried for his bank balance. Naruto generally refused to take the back streets. It was just a sign that the villagers' odd hatred of him was having some effect. No, instead he made a point of taking the main roads. However, that didn't mean he had to like being on them at the end of the day. They were always at their most crowded then, and that meant there were more stares and awful comments flung his way. Just smile. They'll see once you graduate. He coached himself as he plastered on a fake grin and studiously ignored the negative attention. You lookin' at something? Hikari, apparently, wasn't as inclined to ignore it. Her piercing red eyes were locked on an older woman, who had stopped to glare angrily at them. Say what you have to say or move the along, yeah. She said, arms crossed under her chest and foot tapping against the road. The woman only glared harder, but then turned around and kept walking, mumbling to herself about the state of the shinobi forces these days. Hikari scoffed and continued, now moving at a pace that Naruto almost had to jog to keep up with. She led the Naruto to one of the newer training grounds, as she didn't want to explain to the kid why the old one looked like someone had bombed it. Alright, get your stuff out, she said as she plonked herself down on a stump near the edge of the clearing. Naruto groaned loudly and progressed, but opened his bag anyway. Much like the day before, they spent a good portion of their time on the theory. Naruto answered question after question, and every now and then Hikari would add a little to the theory by giving examples from her own experiences. This time she didn't limit them to just one book, and she kept switching between subjects after every chapter or so. Soon enough Naruto felt like his brain was bleeding again, and he felt like hugging the older girl when Hikari took pity on him and announced they were doing something else. You did well, so we're gonna do something extra again. Finally, Naruto all but tossed the book over his shoulder and gave her a massive grin. What are we gonna do, Hikari-nichan? She raised a handful of leaves, eyes twinkling with barely restrained laughter. Did I mention that I'm not your sister? You, Hikari-nichan. This also went much the same as it did yesterday. Naruto still struggled to slow the tiny flames even the slightest bit, but whenever he failed he immediately held out a hand for a new leaf. Hikari had to admire his determination. When Naruto was forced to drop the last leaf Hikari had picked, cursing under his breath, the kunoichi reached out and ruffled his hair. Damn it, I can't even do a basic exercise. Naruto crossed his arms and pouted. I told you it wasn't gonna be easy. You're trying to squeeze an entire lake through a tiny straw, kid. All we can do is widen the straw slowly, Hikari said, scratching her cheek beneath her face mask. Don't worry about it, yeah. This took me quite a while to get right too, and I probably had less chakra when I was your age. Though he felt a bit better at knowing that he wasn't the only one to struggle with the exercise, Naruto still felt a little sore that he'd apparently always have difficulties with something so vital for a shinobi. Not that Hikari gave him much time to linger on it. Since Naruto had energy left, and it fit the lie she had told him that morning, Hikari had him run laps around the field. A lot of laps. As in, she didn't let him stop until sweat was running down his face and his clothing stuck to his body. Why am I doing this? Naruto panted as he passed Hikari, who was lounging on a stump with a cookbook. Can't we practice taijutsu? Of course not, Hikari muttered as she turned the page. We're working on your basics. Physical conditioning is one of those, and you need to get stronger. She noticed the blonde was glaring at her and chucked a kunai at him. No slowing down. The blade barely missed Naruto's ankle and dug deep into the earth, dragging a yelp from him. Is that thing real? In response, the green-haired kunoichi chucked another one at him, which cut his sleeve. What the hell, Hikari-nichan? If nothing else, it did make him move faster. Each time Naruto slowed down, Hikari absently chucked another kunai at him. When he finally collapsed, he was covered in more than a few shallow cuts. I hate you. He groaned into the dirt. Hikari laughed and pulled a scroll out of one of the pouches of her vest. Here, kid. She unrolled the scroll, pressed her thumb to the center and unsealed a water bottle. Something tells me you need to rehydrate. Naruto greedily drank from the bottle while Hikari walked around the field, gathering up the weapons she'd thrown at him. He watched her work for a while, but soon felt himself getting bored and decided to question her further. It was probably best to get as much information from her as he could. Still, as he tried to decide on a topic, he came to the realization that he didn't really care about her missions or what jutsu she could teach him. What's it like to be part of a clan? Hikari froze while inspecting one of her kunai and turned one guarded red eye on him. Why do you want to know? Naruto chuckled and sheepishly rubbed the back of his head. Well, I just wanted to know. I mean, hello, orphan and all. He gestured at himself. It's like a really big family, right? Must be nice. A wistful smile played over his lips as he imagined a clan of his own. I suppose it's sort of like a family. Hikari answered as she sat down, still toying with a kunai. But there's a lot of people with the Hoshiko name who I'm technically related to, but don't know or have never met. Hell, even plenty who aren't even related to me. She gave Naruto a curious look. Aren't there a lot of clan heirs in your class? Ah, yeah, Naruto answered. His smile faltered for a moment. But I don't really have a lot of friends in my class. Besides, I don't want to ask them. He shrugged. I suppose I can see how that would be a little awkward. Hikari muttered, looking at the little blonde. Honestly, she wasn't sure how to answer his question at the moment. She'd have been a lot more favorably disposed towards the whole thing a few years ago than she was now. Still, Naruto had asked, so the least she could do was answer. Actually, family sums it up pretty well, she said as she idly drew meaningless symbols in the sand with her kunai. We're our own people and we love each other, but we all have a duty to ensure the clan does well. Sometimes we fight, but we're all proud to be members of the Hoshiko clan. She smiled and drew a small crown in the sand. We're born from stars, after all. Naruto watched silently, captivated by the way Hikari's eyes softened as she watched her clan's symbol. They clearly meant a lot to her. Is that why you became a kunoichi? To help your clan? Hikari looked up from her drawing and nodded. Partially. My dad's a shinobi and mom was one too. I wanted to be like her when I was little. She died during my 3rd year in the academy. Hikari ran a hand through her green hair and sighed. Her and an entire genin team. No idea what hit them, but they never found bodies and they never arrived where they were supposed to. It still felt strange talking about it. It had gotten easier, sure, but talking about it always seemed to make it that much more final somehow. Oh, I'm sorry. Naruto said quickly. I didn't mean to remind you. While he knew what it was like to miss having a parent in your life, he couldn't say that he knew what it was like to lose one either. Still, he figured it wasn't something he would want to be reminded of at least. Hikari let out a humorless chuckle and shook her head. Kid, it's alright. Don't worry about it. She leaned back to look up at the sky and only then did she realize how late it had gotten. Shit. I think I kept you pretty long. Come on, grab your stuff. She made one more pass of the training ground to make sure she hadn't left any weapons behind, and when she turned she found Naruto picking leaves from the trees surrounding them. What are you doing?